Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, whatever time you've got. This is, let me find the intro, it's here somewhere, Freethought Hour. And we have our usual co-host, the wonderful, what's the word I use? The eye candy from South Africa. My co-host, Tercia. Welcome, Tercia. How the devil are you?
Thank you, John. I'm doing well, and you are a little bit more excited than you normally are. I'm glad to see you here. I'm glad to be here, and looking forward to tonight's Freethought Hour, where we can just be free and think.
Yeah, great. Okay, and our guest tonight is Sarah Valdman. Welcome, Sarah. How the devil are you?
Oh, hey, what's up? I'm good.
Good. And you're in Michigan?
Yeah, in Ann Arbor, in a barn.
Right, okay. Well, very nice. Yeah. So, as I was explaining before we went live, I'm going to pretty much take a back seat in this conversation. I'll be the guy who does the stuff that makes the stream go out. And you and Tercia can talk, and you'll be, I'm interested to hear, because you've self-described as an investigative journalist, but we also know that you're doing a PhD, and that sounds interesting in itself. So get on with it.
You want to explain why I describe myself as a journalist? That's the question.
Yeah, that'd be a good start.
Oh no, it's just me now. All right. Well, so really, how you describe what I do is meta-philosophy, the philosophy of philosophy. I describe myself as an investigative journalist because I kind of see myself as taking a third-party perspective on what's happening in philosophy, specifically analytic philosophy. If that's an area of philosophy you're familiar with, it's tied pretty tightly with like science and mathematics and logic over like the historical and literary stuff associated with so-called continental philosophy. And I try to show that all the problems that philosophers are concerning themselves with are actually instances of one and the same problem, a problem with fitting wholes and parts together. That's why I describe myself as a journalist. The war between wholes and parts, as I put it.
Yeah.
It's really a clickbait description.
Okay, and is that what your PhD is in as well? In that field of study, in the meta philosophy, analytical philosophy? I'd like you to explain a little bit more about analytical philosophy. So, just maybe about philosophy in general. So I know. Maybe what I know about philosophy is dangerous. I do know that critical thinking and logic are elements of philosophy, and those are aspects of philosophy that really interest me. What interests me as well is that what you do, looking at how philosophers do philosophy, because I think that philosophy has become a little bit lost in many ways. I think it needs to be more practical, but tell me something about analytical philosophy. What the hell does that mean in real human language?
Okay, well, so they say there's a split between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, where analytic philosophy is associated with like British philosophers like Bertrand Russell, but also like with logicians. Analytic philosophy tries to work by splitting a whole bunch of problems into parts and using logical analysis to break all those problems into smaller parts. It tries to approach philosophical problems the same way that scientists approach their problems, right? Where so they try to divide an organism into a whole bunch of different organs, study how all the parts work individually, and then put it together to see how the whole works. And you really only understand what analytic philosophy is as opposed to the other kind of philosophy, which is continental philosophy. Continental because it's associated with like the continent in Europe. So like French philosophy, which is notoriously weird and dense. It's not scientific or analytical at all. It's like more literary, like, Hegel, Derrida is associated with them. Yeah. Deleuze.
I'm so glad you said Hegel, because we had a guest on, I don't know, I remember his name, John. He has a YouTube channel as well. and he was on about Hegel. And after that show, I went into a little bit of Hegel, and it just became such a rabbit hole that it's just like, what the hell, you know? It does begin to sound a little bit like Jordan Peterson at times, because maybe because I'm from South Africa, and because I'm more attuned to the British analytical vein, or non-continental philosophy, it attracts me more. And I wonder if it's the same in America. Do you think that the fact that the French and the German philosophers have a totally different way of doing philosophy has anything to do with the fact that they were not colonized? And well, no, that doesn't make any sense, because they were colonizers. Or maybe, do we know why it's so different?
You know, I have no idea. I mean, I know they're just different traditions. I could try to speculate on why, like, England in particular would be prone to coming up with more analytical ideas, and why the French would come up with weird literary stuff. But I really have no idea. It's just two different traditions, I guess.
Do you think philosophy has any practical use? Do you think we need to study it at all?
Well, I mean, you know, there's not, strictly speaking, anything that isn't philosophy, right? I mean, so some people like to say that philosophy is the womb of the disciplines, right? I mean, originally, so the story goes, there was nothing but philosophy. But as various branches of philosophy got more sophisticated, they kind of branched out and became their own thing, right? So a lot of the sciences were originally natural philosophy, right? But eventually they just became so sophisticated and kind of self-contained that they split off and became their own thing. But there's not really a good way of delineating philosophy from non-philosophy. Philosophy is, in general, just the pursuit of intellectual inquiry. But in general, what we call philosophy in academia is just kind of the miscellaneous box of all the things that the other disciplines aren't able to cover. So a lot of the practical stuff ends up becoming its own discipline just because it's important, because a lot of people are focusing on it and working on it together because, you know, it's practical. Whereas a lot of the stuff that's less practical tends to end up in the philosophy bin just because there's not that many people working on it. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, in a way, yes. And I have mixed feelings about philosophy. So as a teacher, I feel that everybody should have at least a basic understanding of both continental and this term that I just learned, analytical philosophy, because I didn't know that there was such a term. I think everybody should have a basic knowledge of philosophy as a pursuit of knowledge, and as a love of knowledge. I always emphasize this idea of loving the pursuit of knowledge, which to me is what philosophy is. And because I work with young people and with people who will never enter academia, because most people don't, I think it's important that we try to take these ideas that sound so lofty and so as if it just belongs in academia, but it doesn't, because in our daily lives we are confronted with philosophical ideas constantly. When you talk about things like, should we have a capitalist system? How should we build the system? The democracy. I know that many countries in the world had or will be having elections this year, not to mention the United States, whose elections are probably taking up a lot of airtime in the world. So I think philosophy is really important, but I also think that philosophy has become a little bit lost in the woods, in the woods of academia. And that's why what you do interests me so much. So when you say you investigate what philosophers say about philosophy, how does one go about that? Do you read newspapers? Do you talk to people? Who do you talk to? And how do you decide who to talk to?
Well, I mostly look at what they actually do in philosophy. So I try to draw out general patterns in the methods that they use for solving problems. That, you know, so I never read newspapers. I don't know. The New York Times tries to send me notifications, but I don't really read it. You never see anything about philosophy in there. It really just involves reading a lot of analytic philosophy and just trying to like intuit like the patterns that lie underneath the words they're using. Because one of the biggest mistakes that philosophers make is confusing words and ideas, where they think because they're expressing something in different words, they're not expressing the same idea. But so what I try to do is look at what people are saying in a lot of different words and show how actually all these different words are being used to mean the exact same thing. Yeah,
I love
that's
that.
the idea.
So who would you say, if you, could you throw some names at me? Who are the analytical philosophers that you are currently looking at and studying? Maybe by chance I know some of the names. Let's see how I do.
Well, so I mean, a lot of what I do isn't the like reading like big names in analytic philosophy, because there's a lot of people. There's a lot of publications, which is actually its own issue in analytic philosophy, because there's the publish or perish thing in academia where everybody's pressured to publish as much as possible. So there is huge volumes of work coming from a lot of different people, and and you probably wouldn't have heard of any of them, but.
I will not take that. I will just take that on the chin,
Well, nobody outside of analytic philosophy reads analytic philosophy. In fact, nobody in analytic philosophy reads analytic philosophy. That's the weird, uncomfortable position that the field is in right now.
Can I come in?
Yeah, hi. Welcome back.
Because you've piqued my interest, as I expected you to. My attitude is that philosophy is about thinking, and it uses words as a vehicle, and words are human fabrications. So there's a disconnect, a discontinuity, if you like, between that activity, which is essentially going on inside heads, and the outside world. And of course, Renaissance philosophers noticed this and came up with natural philosophy, which we now call science. And they realized that just thinking cannot necessarily produce a conclusion. And what you need to do is investigate for a match or not with observations in the outside world. So I like to think in terms of two realms. The inside the head realm, which I like to call the conceptual realm, where anything goes, where we can conceive of Humpty Dumpty, Daleks, Superman, whatever. And the natural realm, which is, more fixed. It's we can't influence it. We have the what do they call it? The theory of mind, because we can work out that other people have got independent thought too. But that's not the same as the outside world. The outside world is coming into us from stimuli of various signals, and it's a different place. What do you think about that?
So that's usually known as dualism, associated with like.
Well. I know that people characterize it as that, but it's a different sort of dualism from the sort which presupposes supernature and nature. Because
you call it something else, right?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that there's the inside the head realm, and that's not supernatural, and the outside realm, which is reality.
Yeah, these are the sorts of issues that interest me because, right, so we insist that what we're talking about isn't supernatural when we're talking about how what's in the head is different from what's out there. But fundamentally, what's happening is the same as in dualism, right, where we're positing that, okay, there's the material world or the natural world, but that is just completely incommensurable with the mental world, right? I mean, it's kind of dualism with a different gloss. I mean, usually, like, at least historically, people would describe that as a distinction between the soul and the body and the world around the body, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, is that the kind of position you want to take?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
That surprises me, actually, because I know most people, I don't know too much about this show, but I know that it's kind of like a science oriented thing, and I've definitely noticed in my experience that like science types prefer pure materialism, like where they say, you know, there's no mind over and above what exists materially, that you know there's just the brain and there's not like a soul or a mind realm above it. So that's interesting.
Yeah, well, there's no evidence for anything supernatural, soul, or mind that is disconnected from brain. Yes, I'm a materialist. You're right.
But so
Yes.
then where's the mind realm?
The mind is it's the, you know, like the job of a muscle is to contract, okay, and the job of a brain is to think. It's a very sophisticated processor, which it happens in the brain, and it's electrochemical patterns that are fleeting but can be stored. It's very much like a computer, but it has no limitations. And we know that it has no limitations because we can invent things that don't exist yet and may never exist. And meta is one category of such things. And I don't like it. I don't like meta.
I wonder if it could be analogous to. It's interesting to me that you say that it's, Sarah, that it's dualism, because while I'll be meta here. While I understand that you say it's a kind of that you think of it as a kind of dualism, I also see it as a materialist myself, that what the ideas in my mind are natural and physical and material, in the sense that all of it is the result of my brain physiology and electrical impulses and biochemical goings on that could seize at any moment, and therefore there's nothing ethereal about it. It's all very it's very real in the sense that it's happening and I'm experiencing it. But whatever I experience inside of my head doesn't necessarily have the potential to become material in the real world, to the extent that it can have an influence. And I was watching, maybe a good analogy is, I was watching some golf earlier this evening with my dad, and one of the golfers has this ritual that apparently it's measuring or something. He steps forward and back and both feet, and then he makes all sorts of funny movements. And then I made a joke. I said, it looks almost as if he's sort of doing a Hail Mary bless type thing before he putts. And my dad said, no, it's his way of focusing. And it's really important, because how you focus can have an effect if you on the outcome, which is true, but also it's not true, because if it were true that whatever I do in my mind could have an effect on the ball, then why can't I just sit on my couch and just think there the ball goes? I still have to pick up the stick or the club, not a stick. Please, golfers out there, forgive me, it's a club, not a stick, right? But I still have to take the white ball in my hand, and it has to be the right type of ball, and I still have to put it down. Would that be an analogy of why I do? It sounds like dualism, but
You've just antagonized our entire golfing audience.
I mean, so it sounds like what you're describing could simply mean that, so, you know, the mind can't directly control the golf ball. So instead it directly controls the hand or whatever, and that then controls the club, that then controls the golf ball. You see what I mean? I mean, so you retain this weird sort of mystery of, well, how is the mind affecting physical things? If you think that the mental realm is a separate thing from the physical realm. And I mean, conversely, if you think there's something special about the mental realm that isn't special about like a hand, right? I mean, then shouldn't there be a mystery about how it causes things, right? I mean, we don't say there's a hand realm, right, where the hand can then reach out into the non-hand material reality and change things, right? So I mean, if we posit that the mental realm is separate from the physical realm, then there should be a mystery. But if we're materialists, then there shouldn't be a mystery. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I see exactly what you mean. But the thing is that unlike a hand, which is purely a mechanical device, the brain is a thinking device, and we know of no limit. I mean, one of our former guests on here was Professor Sophie Scott, who is the director of the psychology of neuroscience department of UCL, University College London. And she announced that in a presentation that she did for us one time, that there's no known limit to the brain's capacity.
Well, known limit, right? So, I mean, we're saying that our brains can't think of something that our brains can't think of. Isn't that a little circular? Right,
Well,
right. I mean, so no known limits to what can be known. Well,
the thing is, the brain can be constantly reorganized. So that puts the kibosh on any prospect of it having a boundary in terms of thought. So
a hand can be reorganized, right? And also, I mean, so you could say one limitation of the mind is you can't imagine a square circle, right? Can you? I mean, I can't.
Well, I see where you're coming from there, but the thing is that you can imagine a square circle in 3 dimensions. I'm sure you're familiar with viewing a cylinder from above or from the side. From the side, it looks like a square if it's, approximately the same height as the diameter. So
that's not a square circle.
Well,
it's a cylinder.
Yes, indeed. Yes, but the reason that you can't imagine a square circle is because circles and squares are purely 2-dimensional and reality isn't.
But I can't imagine a circle, which is 2-dimensional.
Well, you can imagine a circle, but there is no real circle because the universe is actually, although it's quantized, each quantum is separated. So all you can do is join the dots, and that never makes a perfect circle. So do you see where I'm coming from? There's a discontinuity between what we can imagine, we can conceptualize, no problem. I can conceptualize a perfect circle, 100%, no problem. But they don't exist.
So, I mean, it sounds like the limits of the mind are not the limits of the material world, right? But that would, again, suggest that materialism would be false, right? I mean, if we admit that the mind has limits that matter that matter has limits that the mind doesn't have.
Well, no, it doesn't. It just means that the hardware of the mind has the limits of materialism, but that doesn't restrict its activity.
But the activity is material, right?
The activity...
yeah. If the activity isn't material, then there's something that isn't material.
No. The activity is material in the same way as what goes on in a chip, a computer processor is material. But the outcome doesn't have to be.
Material?
Doesn't have to be material. I mean, if
so there's non-material stuff.
No, there's non-material concepts.
And concepts exist, or they don't exist.
Concepts exist, but they don't have to relate to reality. If they did, we would never have invented the jet engine because it didn't exist until it was conceived and then manufactured.
It sounds like you're drawing a distinction between what happens in the real world and what happens in the mind. But yes. I mean, a materialist would want to say that the mind is part of that world, that the mind is real. I mean, the mind itself has to be real.
Yes.
Then all the ideas in it are real. They're just not real in their content, right? So like the content of the idea could be a jet engine, but the idea of the jet engine existed before the jet engine did, but it was real, right? So the concepts exist on this view. And so in your view, the perfect circle does exist. It just exists in the concept in the mind.
Yes, exactly.
In which case it does match reality, right? Because there are perfect circles in reality on this view.
No. no.
Is this analytical philosophy or continental philosophy?
Analytic.
Good. At least we're on the right track.
Yeah. It's mostly just a bunch of bickering about words, you know.
Yeah, that's
That's
right.
a good demonstration.
That is,
Which is entirely what philosophy is about. In fact, if you put two philosophers in a room together, you've got a disagreement.
Oh, if only, you know, nowadays they mostly agree. That's one of the big problems in philosophy nowadays. But
okay. Well, obviously, I don't move in the circles of philosophy, so it's good to know that people somewhere agree about some things. Wow. All right.
they just
So
agree about falsehoods.
we just agree. I didn't get that. We agree about
Falsehoods.
Yes.
falsehoods. Okay.
Popper.
All right.
Yes. Yeah.
Geez,
Popper made a big stride. Yeah.
If I want to ask Sarah my question, I better not leave it till the last 2 minutes, eh? I don't know if my question even fits into philosophy. Well, I suppose it does. Everything fits into philosophy.
Yep. Everything does.
But before, I can't see how long have we been going. What's the because I really would like to know what Sarah thinks about the whole free will business and whether it's anything at all that analytical philosophy can or does look into.
Well, I think we have plenty of time, right? We have like 30 minutes.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Yeah, well, okay, you know, this really touches on some complicated stuff. But so yeah, free will is something that analytic philosophy is really interested in. And it's actually one of the areas where I disagree with a lot of analytic philosophers about how to handle the problem. So in analytic philosophy, right, their approach is to break a problem down into a lot of different possible solutions, right?
Yeah.
So the problem of free will is very broadly that on one hand, if an action is free, then it can't be determined by anything. It can't be causally determined, right? So if an action is already causally determined by something, it shouldn't be free. But on the other hand, it seems like everything is causally determined, right? And so it's all about trying to work out the tension between, how could it be that we're free if everything we do is causally determined? And so there's three basic positions. One of the positions says we do have free will, but we're wrong that everything is causally determined. So the stuff we do is free because it's not causally determined, right? And they usually call them libertarians, which is totally different from being like a political libertarian, right?
Yep.
And so then another approach is to just reject that we have freedom, right? And say, well, since our actions are causally determined, we're therefore not free. And those are usually called the determinists.
Yeah.
And then there's a third position, usually called compatibilism, which is the position that actually we're free and, you know, it's causally determined, but for whatever reason, those things are still compatible. That's why they're called the compatibilists.
Yeah.
And so the literature on the problem is basically all of the people trying to hash out the pros and cons of every view and then kind of like putting it on the scales. Like, okay, everything has cons, everything has pros. Which one has the best, you know, relative weight? Like, which one has the most pros relative to their cons? And of course, nobody can agree on which one, you know, has slightly more pros than cons. And so there's just this perpetual literature of people arguing that actually this view is slightly more plausible than this one. You know, that's why a lot of people, you know, think that philosophy has just kind of gotten stuck because they're just kind of rehashing mostly the same old stuff on the free will debate. But so, I mean, if you're asking what I personally think about the issue, my approach and the approach of my partner to Misha Valdman, we have a Substack where we write about a lot of this stuff. But so the idea is that when we're faced with this sort of issue where we have kind of a stalemate between a bunch of different sides. Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, go to that website. When we're stuck between a bunch of different sides on an issue like this, instead of trying to figure out which side is correct, we should try to look to see what features of the problem make it the case that we're stuck between all of these different positions. Like try to break down, well, why do we perceive there to be a tension between causal determination and freedom? And is there any other way that we can account for this issue?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think the approach should be, instead of trying to take a side in the debate. So really my interest is very different than the interest of most philosophers of free will. because my interest is in asking, why does this problem come up? Not how do we solve this problem?
Right.
Because I think in order to
Okay.
solve a problem, you have to know where it's coming from, like what it is.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why, I'm really concerned to look out for confusions about words, because my suspicion is that there's actually a lot of problems in philosophy that are fundamentally the same
Yes.
problem as the free will debate. But
Yes.
this isn't obvious to us because we're confusing differences of words for differences of concepts.
Sarah, I need you to just say that phrase again, because I think it's really profound. You said the problem is not why do we get stuck on the I should have written it down because
I can never repeat something I said, but I can try.
It's not choosing a side, it's deciding what the actual problem is.
Yeah. Instead of getting caught in, Kant called these antinomies, right? Where it seems like we're being pulled in two different directions, and there doesn't really seem to be any way to choose between them. Like we can just kind of basically say, well, this one's slightly better, right? Whenever we're stuck in an antinomy like that, what we should do is not pick sides, but to take a step back and see why this antinomy is coming up. Why is it that we think that we have to take one of these sides? Because I mean, at this point, how many years has it been that we've been talking about free will and we haven't been able to choose between these three positions, right? So clearly we've just framed it wrong.
Yeah. Do you know, I want to apply that to the wider society. I want to say, rather than support the left or the right, which if you join either of those teams, all you're doing is perpetuating the conflict. I say what you should be doing is supporting the referees. You should be activating the silent majority who don't want to join either of those extremes. That's just me.
Or would it also be analogous to saying, instead of saying you should either be left or right, ask why is there a left and why is there a right? And where does that come from? What I would like to say about the whole free will thing is I do think that the compatibilist position is untenable. I think that I really think that we shouldn't even be going there. But I really like what you say about not getting stuck between either or, but asking why do we have these two choices. So your approach, what does your approach do with the third one that's in the middle? And that's what I'm saying, just throw out compatibilism and just rather look at why do we have these.
I may be more sympathetic to compatibilism, but yeah, it's kind of like so say you had a crack in a window, right? Like there's a crack running down the middle of your window, and you were to ask, wow, where did these two sides of the window come from? I mean, the thing you should be looking at is the crack, right? The crack is the interesting thing. The crack is just making it look like there's these two sides of the window, but they only appeared.
Oh, I love that.
What a wonderful way of expressing this problem. So here's my view. I think that time comes into this because it's relentless and we can do nothing about it, and it always goes forwards. So determinists can say we're at this point on the conveyor belt, and looking back it shows that everything has been caused. But what they're ignoring is the fact that this is not just a point on a conveyor belt, it's a junction of a crossroad where you can actually choose.
Well, I mean,
causation. I still disagree with that.
I'll help you, to push against him here. Since you're doing philosophy, but I mean, you can't see causation happening. I mean, how do you know that something's caused something else as opposed to two things just happening next to each other?
Well, yes, I know that problem, but I tend to look at a domino rally and see causation. I can't see that it's just an accident.
Yeah, well, you can't see it, but yeah, go.
But exactly, John. If you think of dominoes falling, the only reason if you say that there's a choice on this, if you think of this conveyor belt and you say from this point onwards it can go that way or that way. Number one, you on the conveyor belt. So, and the conveyor belt is going in a particular, you can't get off the conveyor belt. And number two, if you think in terms of dominoes, the only way that a domino can, if you have one row of dominoes and then two rows of dominoes, and then one domino that falls will possibly, depending on how they fall, the analogy breaks down a little bit, but you still have a cause for either of the directions.
Yes.
And that is determined. There's nothing free about that.
Can I just draw attention to Dean's comment here? Dean, thank you.
I see Dean, but I'll have to put my glasses on to see. Of course we have free will. We do not have a choice in the matter. Yes, I agree with that.
Thanks, Dean. I love that.
But I really do like the approach of the crack in the mirror. Instead of asking, focus on. So what do you see if you focus on the crack in the mirror or in the glass, Sarah? I'm really keen to hear.
I'll try to put it simply, but so what we have in the case of the free will debate is a paradox that occurs when something tries to represent itself, right? So you can think of the mind as a scheme of representation, right? Like, so, I'm seeing a bunch of stuff in here right now. You're not seeing most of it, but I am, right? But there's also an image of me, right? So I have this idea of me being in the world. So my mind is a scheme of the whole world, and that includes a little me in there, where that little me is also supposed to represent that whole world that I'm representing. Did you see what I mean? So like my mind is like a picture of a world that includes a little picture of my picture of the world.
Yeah.
So there's a paradox here, right? Because as we would put it in mereology, an object can't be a proper part of itself. That is, like, that little picture in the big picture cannot be as complicated as the whole picture. It has to be a simplified version. So this little picture of me, which is my consciousness, my image of myself, cannot actually match the whole thing.
Yeah, it's a viewpoint, and it's an unalterable viewpoint. We wake up as babies and realize that we're in here and looking out, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, but so there's this tricky thing where there's actually two of me on this picture, right? Because I'm the whole thing, but I'm also the little part of the thing, right? So there's actually two Sarahs, right? And so one of those Sarahs is not free, right? So the little Sarah is related to all the other things in the world, right? Little Sarah is behind the laptop right now.
Sure. We create a representation of reality inside our heads based on the stimuli that are coming to our sense organs. And because of the viewpoint, we assume that the center of it is us. And of course, this has led to all sorts of bad ideas about egocentric humans being the chosen species and their planet being the center of the universe, and it's all nonsense.
Well, egocentrism is scientific, right? Because if you just look empirically at the world, you will never see anything that doesn't put you at the middle. I mean, egocentrism is science. You have to go beyond science if you want to get beyond the self, right? You have to abstract away from your experience and think of stuff other than what you experience.
Yes. You have to be less I and more the outside.
Well, but here's the weird thing, right? The outside is actually a picture in my mind, right? So when I'm talking about the outside, what I'm talking about is my image in my mind that I call the outside, right? Which is not actually outside of me. It's outside the little me, right? The little me that is surrounded by all the other images. But what about the outside of the big thing? That's a whole different thing. There's two selves and there's two outsides.
One explanation for consciousness that I like is that it is a movie that we have constructed inside our heads for us to live in and relate to.
Well,
So,
the problem with that picture is that it doesn't explain why consciousness would be so weird. I mean, why do we find consciousness to be such an interesting, strange thing? I expect that the only thing that could explain consciousness is a weird sort of paradox, right? I mean, a movie, like just a regular movie, there's nothing that crazy or interesting about a movie, right? Like, I don't know, The Big Lebowski or whatever, right? There's nothing paradoxical about that. You know, nobody has Big Lebowski studies, but there's consciousness studies at universities, right? So why does consciousness seem so strange to us? It must be because it's some kind of paradox, right? And that's a paradox I often call double counting, right? Because it's that the self is counted twice. The self is the big thing, but also the little thing in the big thing. And I think that is a better picture of consciousness just because it captures the strangeness of it.
So Dean wants to ask questions. Should we encourage him?
Sure,
Dean,
sure.
fire away. Give us one of your questions. He's going to take a little while. In the meantime, so can we get down to the real Sarah? How did you get to be the interesting person that you are today?
Oh man, I mean, nothing that interesting has happened to me. I left my partner to go to Michigan, and I spent a lot of time alone taking weird philosophy classes. And when you're alone, I have some work that's arguing independently that loneliness is skepticism, because other people, validate the foundations of your belief. And the idea is that when we're lonely, we have trouble believing in the external world as we usually understand it because we don't have the validation from other people. I don't know. My personal story is that I just spent a lot of time being alone, and I had to just kind of devise completely new foundations for how I understood the world because I didn't have enough validation from other people.
Well, I would say that all validations are false anyway.
Of course they are, right? I mean, because there isn't an objectively correct big picture, right? To have in your mind, right? And so, I mean, without other people to tell us what to believe, we're very lost. But, I still think that there's a way to create a good representation, but I think it needs to focus on forms rather than words. And that's why, what I'm interested in is talking about the form of the big thing that's the same as the little thing and the paradox there, instead of talking about words like consciousness and self.
But Sarah, do you think it's possible that we can ever move away from words? Because even in expressing the forms, we have to use words. And
yes, it's a problem.
One of the great paradoxes that I think we need to drill down to, if could, is language. Because whenever I have discussions about consciousness or free will, it always boils down somewhere that the words you use, the way you express it, the choice of words has a massive role. And I agree with you 100% that we need to move past the words. But even in saying we need to move away from the words to the forms, how do you do that without using words?
Big problem.
You have to use the words, but you have to cultivate an intuition that can see the forms that are being expressed by the words, right? So you need to kind of change the way you're hearing what people are saying. And instead of like trying to think in terms of concepts, which is really, I think, words, you should try to just see what picture they're painting with their sentences or their paragraphs.
But depending on, because words have two aspects. There's what they mean when they're transmitted and what they mean when they're received. And I think I can call him a friend. Professor A.C. Grayling, a philosopher you may have heard of. He can prove, in quotes, that there is no God. And I can't. And I'm a retired science teacher, you know. But what he does is he manipulates the meaning of the word proof until it works for him.
That's what all the philosophers do.
I mean, I love him and I greatly respect him, but that's a point of disagreement that we have. So here's Dean coming in with this question. Look at this.
Are you there? Okay, I need to put a split. Oh.
Good one, isn't it? Thanks, Dean.
Well, it depends what brain boundedness is, right? I mean, what we found is that there's correlations, right? There's all sorts of weird correlations, right? I mean, so confirmation can mean that it's consistent with a hypothesis, or it can mean that it proves the hypothesis, or that it's merely evidence that serves in favor of the hypothesis.
And there we are, straight in the word problem again, because some of us would define confirmation as very different from consistent with.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem, right? That's the problem with words, is that, you know, you could say that they're simply ambiguous, that they have a lot of meanings, but like it's also like ontologically indeterminate what the meaning is, right? Like, I mean, really what we do when we use words is intend to pick out something objective out there that like truly corresponds to it. We almost never have actual definitions in mind, right? We're trying to reach out and capture something that's natural, that's actually really out there. But first of all, I mean, there could be a lot of natural things out there that could be picked out by a word like confirm, right? But here's a deeper problem. There probably are no natural things out there that are confirmation. I mean, that's my worry, is that there isn't really any deep truth about what it means to confirm something. And if there's no deep truth about what confirmation is, or about anything out there that corresponds to confirmation, then inevitably, the only way you can respond to a question like that is ask, well, what is meant by confirm?
Yes.
Because it's laden with content. It doesn't really pick out a form, right? It just brings in a lot of content. And so there's not a satisfying way to answer that question.
Absolutely. I agree with you wholeheartedly there, because I don't think that there is such a thing as absolute. You just used the word absolutely, didn't you? Yeah, I don't think there is absoluteness. I think everything is relative. So we're stuffed.
Well, I mean, like absolutely relative.
Well, there again, you see, what you're doing there is entirely within the mental realm. Absolutely relative doesn't exist. The universe doesn't know it.
But you're in the universe, right? And you know it.
I am in the universe, but my brain has the capacity to think outside of reality.
You don't know it, John. You just think it.
Yeah, it's a hypothesis. Granted, I have no evidence for it, but it works for me.
Well, here's an interesting issue with that, right? So your brain is a part of you, or at least even the part of your brain that's thinking that is a mere part of you. But when your brain thinks it, you say that you think it, right? But so your brain is also part of the universe, right? Right. So I mean, there's a part of the universe that's thinking this. So in what sense are you thinking it and the universe isn't?
Well, sure, that there is no thing that isn't part of the universe, but what we have in our brains is a thing that can conceptualize stuff that isn't part of the universe. I mean, there is no such thing as a Dalek, but we can think of one.
So the concept exists. So there is such a thing.
Well, no. Concepts are not necessarily related to reality.
But they're in reality.
There is reality, but concepts are not necessarily related to it. Because, I mean, I can conceptualize an oak tree, and I can go outside and see an oak tree that represents my concept. But before Sir Frank Whittle, who conceptualized the jet engine, that match wasn't possible. So what I'm saying is conceptualization is in one realm and reality is in another. There's no problem with that, surely.
So there's two. Okay, sorry.
But maybe before we get to why there's two problems with what John just said, maybe I can ask you, Dean. Dean said the consciousness is brain bound. Do you? I am convinced that the evidence we have at the moment, in my opinion, points to the fact that consciousness is brain bound. Do you agree with that statement or not?
Well, I mean, okay, so in a manner of speaking, yes, but there's a lot of ways you could push back against that, right? So really what we have is that all of our evidence for consciousness is brain bound, right? So I mean, if somebody's consciousness just floated away from their body after they died, or like an extra consciousness floated in to the brain when we split it, right? I mean, the evidence would be exactly the same, right? I mean, just personally, do I prefer to interpret it as saying that, yeah, consciousness is brain bound? That's how I'd prefer to interpret the evidence. But I mean, there's not really like I don't see an objective reason why we have to interpret it that way. I mean, all that we know is that we can only get evidence for consciousness by working with a brain, right? But I mean, that makes sense because the brain is something that we can see and consciousness is not. So I'm actually sympathetic to saying that consciousness is brain bound, but I don't think that should convince anybody who thinks that it's not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see where you're coming from with that.
It also makes me think of a person that I don't particularly like, or I heard Sam Harris ask Jordan Peterson, "Do you believe in God?" And Jordan Peterson's answer was it would take him 2 weeks to answer that, because what do you mean by do? What do you mean by believe? What do you mean by I? And then what do you mean by God? And I'm always, I get a bit frustrated when it feels to me that we sort of get stuck into sort of a weird hard solipsism problem. Do you think there's any connection here between the problem of hard solipsism and the hard problem of consciousness, and that all these things are sort of just coming together, and it's all part of the crack in the window?
Well, I mean, so just on the question, like that, what Harris posed to Peterson, I mean, really, the issue is that it's not clear what's being asked when you ask somebody, do you believe in God, right? I mean, when we pose a question like that, the presupposition is that there's like a privileged question, right? There's one thing that everybody would understand by, do you believe in God? Right. But so that's why, it's frustrating when somebody responds by saying, well, it depends on what you mean by this and that. I mean, really what that response indicates is that there's multiple questions in the vicinity, and it's unclear which of the questions is actually being asked, if any of them, right? Because I mean, sometimes we just pose a question with words and we haven't really thought very much about which question we're trying to ask.
We would call this word salad, and it doesn't get a lot of respect. But don't you just love this comment that made me laugh? Sorry about that, but it's Dean. Look, Jordan Peterson is audible chloroform. Thanks.
Dean also asked an interesting question. Dean asked, where do we go when we dream?
Yes. Well, in my model, that would be simply the brain doing its limitless capability of conceptualizing.
Well, that's interesting you say that, right? Because you think that when we're awake, the stuff happening in our mind magically corresponds to something outside of it.
No,
whereas when we're sleeping,
not necessarily.
Okay, sorry. Pull back the word magic, right? But you think when we're awake, we have reason to believe there's something else, right? So when we're awake, there's images in our mind, and those images are images of something. Right. That's really out there.
No. Listen, I'm awake at the moment, and I can conceptualize real things.
So you say, John. So you say.
Yes, I know. Well, this is my approximation. So I can conceptualize real things, an oak tree, for example, and I can also conceptualize Humpty Dumpty. There's no boundary there. So the other thing I wanted to ask you before we run out of time, Sarah, is have you any knowledge of Professor Anil Seth?
Never heard of them.
No? Oh, well, he's a big consciousness expert at the university not far from me, the Sussex University, and I think he's the director of the Sussex Centre for Consciousness Science, which aims to unravel the mystery of what consciousness is. I would highly, he's spoken at an event I organised some years ago, but I thoroughly recommend you to investigate him.
Well, people that do consciousness science are not really interested in solutions to their problems. Uh, well, that's too strong, right? But I mean, I don't think there can be a consciousness science, right? Because I mean, the consciousness is the very thing that's never being observed, right? I mean, so right now I'm observing a laptop and three faces on it, one of which is mine, my water bottle, a whole bunch of stuff around me. I'm seeing all that stuff. The one thing I'm not seeing is my consciousness. The consciousness is this thing that's always hovering above, or beyond what you're actually looking at, right? Science is all about observation, but consciousness is almost by definition the thing that's not being observed at any given point.
Yes.
I don't think there can be consciousness science.
Okay, interesting. Well, but there's I mean, you talk about the boundary of science. What is your expression? You're investigating the frontier, was it? And there is an area where speculation is rife because we don't know yet. And consciousness is one of those places. And therefore, it's ripe for investigation. The problem is how.
Oh, you're asking me?
Yes, how can we? It's a question that needs answering. How can we investigate it?
Philosophy, right? By looking at not the content of the things we're thinking, but the form, right? Because what we're experiencing is consciousness. And so if we want to study consciousness, we need to look past the content of all the stuff we're seeing. Ignore the fact that right now I happen to be looking at a laptop. I happen to be looking at a water bottle. And instead, consider the forms that are always present every time you're looking at anything. This was Kant's original approach. And that's why he created such a revolution in philosophy.
Could you expound on what exactly you mean when you say look at the form? So instead of looking at the laptop, what would the form be?
The form is the thing you're never looking at, but that structures every particular thing you see. So you would say that the form is all of the a priori stuff that you carry in. So logic and mathematics, right, is always true. Why is it always true? Because it's part of the form of consciousness, right? I mean, I think that when we study logic, for example, we really are studying consciousness, right? Because we're tracing these formal, meaning formal rules that apply whenever we look at anything.
Okay, I want to come in here because I don't think there is such a thing as a priori. I think all knowledge has come about a posteriori. And what the problem that mankind has is because of his egocentrism. And he thinks that we are the only creatures who could conceive of these highfalutin ideas. And I'm not like that. I think that we've inherited the abilities to do this sort of stuff from predecessors, including not just the apes, but going right back to the earliest creatures that had a brain. And what they discovered back then, a posteriori, is what we now think is a priori, because it's inherited rather than discovered.
I mean, it seems a little far-fetched to me to think that you could discover anything without already having a basic background structure, like without already believing something.
I agree that. I agree that there are axioms, but what I'm saying is we didn't create them. Our remote ancestors did. And we simply think that they are axioms, whereas in actuality, they were a posteriori discoveries by some primitive creature.
How did you come to learn this?
I'm very keen on evolution.
So you observed the people or the, I don't know, fish coming
No,
out of the ocean
of course,
who discovered P and P or not P, for example, right?
No,
right. So you've observed them
no, of course
discover logical laws. I mean, how could you observe logical laws?
Of course I haven't. No, of course I haven't. But what I have observed is that change happens and selection happens in real time, and therefore, given us making the assumption of universality, it happened back then too.
Assumption?
And axiom.
Where did that come from?
Well, yeah, okay. It's one of the foundations of science that if you take away that rock, the whole tower collapses. And we know the tower works because
so there must be a priori, right? Because otherwise science would collapse.
Yeah, but it isn't a priori in the sense of human a priori. It's a priori in the sense that earlier creatures found that it worked. And we have inherited that knowledge biologically, DNA-wise. So we look at it as if it's an a priori discovery.
I mean, so the position is that like fish discovered logic, and that's why we think logic is a priori true.
Absolutely, yes.
So how did fish discover logic?
Same way we did.
Well, we didn't really. I mean, we reflected on what we already thought, right? So we were like, well, either this laptop is here or it's not here, right? And we abstracted from that logical laws, right? But that's exactly what I mean by
that's only because we have the capability of doing that, and fish didn't, But fish discovered how the world works. Otherwise, they would be bumping into things, wouldn't they? So,
well, you can believe false things and still get along perfectly fine. Just go out on the street, right? People believe all sorts of dumb things, but they're still surviving. I mean, truth is definitely not necessary to survive. I don't see any reason why evolution would select for truth. In fact, a lot of times truth undermines survival, right? Sometimes it's good to be deluded.
We're going to have you back and talk about truth because we've run out of time.
Oh, sorry.
Absolutely, because so many thoughts were going through my mind. One of which was that perhaps we shouldn't be so hung up on truth, because fish survived and evolved, for argument's sake, into what we are today, because enough of the ones that survived accepted that this thing is going to eat me and I have to get away from it. Whether it was true or not was not at stake. They experienced being chased, and that's the material truth that mattered, and that enabled that particular one to survive. So fascinating. My mind is reeling, and I was there at one point. You said something, and I thought, you look quite young. You don't have children, do you?
I got a 1-year-old.
You do. Well done. Good for you. Well, okay.
Thanks.
Now my argument falls completely flat, because
oh really?
Because at one stage I was thinking, you said something and I thought, well, but then this 1-year-old of yours is not yet a teenager who's hungry all the time. Because if I try to use some of your explanations on my 17-year-old, he would give you some thoughts. Well, wow, okay. And it's, sorry, I don't want to sound like J.D. Vance, because if you didn't have children, it would have been perfect. But it's interesting that having children changed my view of many things completely. So that is another, and this thing about truth and reality. Wow, my mind is reeling.
I hope you're interested. No, usually nobody asks what me and my partner work on. Nobody asks.
So I forgot. I was so involved in the conversation. I couldn't focus on my job as the producer of the show. So I've forgotten to make you an outro, but I'm just doing it now and it's converting. I just have to upload it to the software. Where's it gone? Come on.
Good, I did my dramatic exit, you know.
Well,
there it is. Okay, I can upload it. Give me a minute. Meanwhile, I'll say that next week we've got another wonderful guest whose name is Richard D. Martino. There you go. So look forward to him, and we'll have another fantastic conversation. Let me just put this video clip in. Come on, software. I need a new computer. It's too slow. Okay, there it goes.
Well, Sarah, I thoroughly, I feel like I've just done an intellectual marathon, which is great. Thank you so much. It was most stimulating, and I will certainly be pondering. I think I'll come back and view this conversation, make some notes, because maybe we need to rehash some of these things. I have many questions that I still would like to ask. I hope you had some fun.
Yeah,
I love getting emails and stuff. So send some questions. Yeah,
right.
Fantastic.
So
good luck with raising the 1-year-old.
Thank you very much.
That's tough.
I've got bad news for you. They grow into teenagers.
Don't remind me. I don't want to even think about that.
Enjoy every moment.
Yeah. Anyway, wonderful. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Tercia. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Dean, for your contributions. Say bye-bye.
Bye.